In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is class 34 of our Orthodox Survival course. Today is the 6th of March, 2019, on the church calendar, the feast of the Holy 42 Martyrs of Amorion. It is March 19th on the secular calendar. Before I start our class, I would like to thank those who answered my appeal last week for financial support. You know that I'm the priest of a small mission in the Detroit metropolitan area here in Michigan, St. Irene of Crisovolando Church, under the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece. And my parish is small. My parishioners are very valiant. They're very generous. And they have done their best to support me, but of course we're a small parish. And now that this internet ministry has kind of taken off, and many people outside of our parish are benefiting from my work, it's only appropriate that those who benefit help my parishioners support me. I'm a full-time priest living on a part-time salary, and I need your help. But I don't want to be one of those tiresome people who are always asking for money. But periodically I will have to repeat my appeal so that we can keep going with this work which seems to be helping others. Orthodox Christians, as well as those searching for the truth, those coming to Orthodoxy. And I glorify God and thank God that we're able to help others. And I thank those who answered our appeal. Some have been very generous. How you can help, the ways in which to help, I'll put in our notes for the class as I post them on Spreaker, and also the full notes at my blog, orthodoxtruth.org. Some listeners have written this past week to ask where the notes are for these classes, and I want to make 2 points. One is where to find the notes, and the other is the nature of the notes. These notes are fairly complete, but they're not entirely complete. You'll probably notice that I make extemporaneous remarks and go apparently off subject to an excursus of some kind, and that's only natural. It's in the nature of the thing, and I think that helps. It's both more entertaining, so to speak, and also more helpful to add insights as they come to mind. The other point is where to find the notes. I have a blog, orthodoxtruth.org. That's all lowercase letters, one word, orthodoxtruth.org. And the Spreaker page where the podcast appears, and then the blog page where the notes appear, will be cross-linked. So whether you open the blog first or open the Spreaker page first, you'll find the link to the other. And in my notes, I will, both on the Spreaker information section where the podcast appears, and then on my notes at the blog, I'll give instructions to how to give monetary support if God so moves you and if you're so able. May the Lord bless you. Another thing to point out is many of you probably know that I've recently self-published a book through Lulu. That book is called The Eternal Sacrifice, and the purpose of the book is to help us benefit from the readings at Vespers from the book of Genesis, which we read on the weekdays of Great Lent. It's now the second week of Great Lent, and if you are not able to attend Vespers, which most of us are not on a daily basis in a parish church, it would still be helpful to read from the texts of Vespers or from the Old Testament readings. And one of the readings is the first reading at Vespers every day weekday during Lent is from Genesis. And so I wrote this little book. It consists of commentaries that appeared originally in my blog a couple of years ago, and they're gathered together in one little volume with the Genesis text and then with the little commentaries that I wrote. It's something that you could take to work, or that a mother at home can stop during her day and read for a few minutes and benefit from the inspired words of the prophet Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis while in a state of divine vision on Mount Sinai, and gave us these truths about the beginning of all things in the visible universe and the early days of the patriarchs. So tonight's class 34. We're in part 2 of our course, which I've entitled Understanding the 20th Century and Dealing with the 21st Century that we're living in. This is class 34, entitled The Great Stereopticon, Session 1. Now let us talk some more about this project we discussed in class 33 to redefine humanity, or rather to create a new kind of human being through various means. In the next few classes, we will focus on the mental world created by the big monster called the communications media, that vast machine that Richard Weaver calls the great Stereopticon in Ideas Have Consequences. But before going to the subject of the class, I'd like to make some preliminary remarks. Before this class, our class proper, I need to deal with a few preliminaries. From here on out, we are probably going to be doing a little preliminary section at the beginning of some of the classes for two reasons. One reason is to do a reality check, to ask ourselves if we have acted recently on what we have been learning. After all, a survival course only works if you act on your knowledge in order to survive. Since I like short lists, I'll just ask 1 to 3 questions at the beginning of each class. For example, the nature of the question is, have we done such and such this past week to fight the spirit of the age, to live as human beings, to live as Orthodox Christians? For example, this week, referring to an image from our previous class, I could ask, were you attentive this past week, which actually last week was the first week of Great Lent this year? Were you attentive the first week of Great Lent? Did you live prayerfully? Or have you acted like the zombie mind that we talked about in our last class? Okay, so we should ask ourselves that realistically and say, well, I want to benefit from our survival course. Well, did I act like a zombie or did I act like a Christian last week? The other reason for preliminaries is to make corrections to things I've said earlier. This is important. Corrigenda, corrections. This class is a work in progress. I was just writing to a correspondent last night, a young mother who was writing to encourage me, who has found, she and her husband have found my work useful, this class that we're doing very useful, in forming their own mindset and raising their children. And I pointed out to her that I'd rather not be doing this. There are people far more qualified than I am to do this. I'm an amateur putting this thing together willy-nilly, catch as catch can. But since nobody else is doing it, I might as well go forward. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So the nature of the beast is that I'm going to be making a lot of mistakes. So the reason for preliminaries is to make corrections to things I've said earlier. Okay, this is a work in progress. It's a team effort. We're all in this together. We have some well-read listeners who will find mistakes, or at least defects, in my presentation. See, things that are wrong or things that are just missing, right? And as they point things out, I want to correct or clarify what I've said, okay, in order to give us together, right, the most complete picture possible. One housekeeping task I need to point out. I need to point out that the link I gave last week to Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver is not a good link, thanks to the listener who wrote in to warn me about that. There is a link that works, and I've changed the notes from the last class, and also in the notes to today's class, I'm giving you the link to get a PDF. Now, I encourage everyone to actually buy a copy of the book. As I pointed out in our last class, you can get very inexpensive copies. It's a must-have book for your family library and to read. And but also, if you want to download a PDF of the book, it's online. So I fixed the notes from class 33 to provide this correct link instead of the bad link I gave last time. One correction or a clarification is in regard to Michael Hoffman's views on usury. I've mentioned his book twice, I believe. Once much earlier, I believe, when we were talking about the Renaissance and the origin of the modern banking system. And I've mentioned again in our last class. A correspondent from Romania who has been following our course and who is actually somewhat of a student of economics and also someone very sympathetic to America and to our story, to our history. This brother from Romania wrote to remind me that the Orthodox Church in the East did not absolutely forbid usury, which I believe I did point out. Hoffman is writing from the viewpoint of the Western Church, in which canon law, going back even to its Orthodox period, always forbade usury absolutely. In other words, no Christian was allowed to lend money at all, period, at interest, that is. So usury in the West is considered a malum in se, an evil in itself. That's never permissible to a Christian under any circumstances. In the East, the church and the imperial government took the approach of controlling usury. And this is characteristic of the Eastern Christian mind versus the Western Christian mind. In other words, it's going to happen, even if we don't like it, and therefore let's deal with it realistically while trying to keep it to a minimum. Okay? So my point in encouraging anyone to read Michael Hoffman's book is not to form a party agitating for our synod or any Orthodox authority or bishop or priest to excommunicate laymen who lend money at interest, although it is heinous for an Orthodox Christian to lend a fellow Orthodox Christian, for example, on a personal basis, money and then charge him interest. That's a heinous act. But I'm not getting into the business of telling the bishops or priests to excommunicate people who do that. That's not my purpose here. My purpose was to introduce our listeners to the historical process by which the modern banks arose in Western Europe. Because remember, our course is so much of it's about Western Europe, because we're talking about what happened in the West to bring about the present state of affairs and civilization today. So my purpose was to introduce our listeners to this historical process by which the modern banks arose in Western Europe, which Hoffman describes quite in detail, and later came to dominate the global economy and to enslave the formerly sovereign national governments. Right? It's very important to understand we don't have sovereign governments. We have governments that are actually servants of private interests that control the financial network. Okay, if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about politics, at least, and certainly not in the Western world, and in general, globally. Okay. Another clarification involves Richard Weaver's view of the scholastics, the 12th, 13th century Roman Catholic scholars, the schoolmen. My son, who's a very perceptive student, my son's been reading Ideas of Consequences, and with his fresh eyes, he saw and pointed out to me that Weaver himself regretted the scholastics' overemphasis on Aristotle, something I completely forgot about. I failed to point out. Despite Weaver's emphasis on the figure of the medieval scholar, he does express admiration for the ascetic struggle of the monk and the exploit of the Christian warrior, those two exemplars of Christian virtue from the Orthodox period of the Western Church, those two exemplars that the West and East have in common. Right? Of course, there's the martyr, which we all have in common. Then there's the ascetical monk and the self-sacrificing warrior, which are the two types of striving for holiness and exemplars of behavior that East and West have in common. But without having the Orthodox viewpoint, Weaver does not connect all the dots. Right? He does not conclude that what we need to do is get back to orthodoxy, that the Orthodox Church has the answers. Weaver's solution is that we need to balance Aristotle with Plato, which is typical of Western Christian intellectuals, who simplistically call the early Middle Ages Platonic and the High Middle Ages Aristotelian. Okay? Of course, we know that the answer is to return to the Fathers, who always knew throughout late antiquity, throughout the Middle Ages, and into our own time, right, to modern times. The Holy Fathers always knew and know exactly how to balance Plato and Aristotle, and to keep them in their place, which is as auxiliary to theology, not as some kind of a box enclosing theology, which is what happened with the schoolmen in the Middle Ages. And really, going back to St. Augustine, what happened to St. Augustine, where he sort of encloses theology in his Platonic, within his Platonic worldview. So the Holy Fathers don't do this, right? They know Plato and Aristotle backwards and forwards, and they use language, primarily Aristotelian language. So the Holy Fathers use of Platonic insights, but Aristotelian language to craft the language of the Church's theology. But it's always in service of the revealed truth and the tradition. Whereas with the schoolmen, it becomes a box, right, that encloses the theology. And the late medieval and Renaissance popes end up declaring that only the schoolmen's interpretation of the Fathers is to be taught in the Western Church, and so that they it's a reductio, right? They just took the schoolman's way of approaching the fathers and made that normative instead of saying, well, that's just one approach. And so the Orthodox, of course, never adopted that. This is a good time to remind everyone that I am not an academic, I am not a scholar, and I'm not a specialist by any means. There are a lot of things I don't know. Just think of me as your older student leading the study group. I'm learning a lot of these things just one step ahead of you. I'm struggling with them, and I'm sharing some insights. But even though you and I are not scholars, we are human beings, and we are Christians, and we cannot shirk the duty to form an integrated picture of the whole in order to make choices and act in the world on the basis of what we know to be the truth. We cannot wait until we get all the details straight. And frankly, the specialists themselves will never get all the details straight. And they will argue about the details till the end of the world. Each of these experts being convinced he knows better than the next man. For the details, for in-depth study of this or that, I can refer you to people who know more than I do about this or that. But my task is to take what I can from these various smarter and more informed people and then weave it together as kind of a less smart, kind of a dumb person, but who needs to weave it together, right, in order to live, right, on the basis of the Church's tradition, into a comprehensive vision to help us construct that Orthodox lens we've been talking about, right, the lens through which to view the world around us. And, as I wish never to cease reminding you and myself, this is not strictly an intellectual task. It is preeminently a spiritual task, performed in the setting of purification of our intellects through the grace-filled activity of Orthodox life, life in the Church. We must grow in virtue if we hope to grow in understanding. We must cleanse the mind of the effects of the passions if our mind is to function properly. Another caveat I need to make is to point out that, like most of my fellow insular Anglo-Saxons, I have this problem of not being able to read or speak other languages fluently. Okay? Most of the historical and philosophical subjects we have been talking about have in fact been dealt with by authors coming from an Orthodox background, writing in Greek or Russian or Romanian and so forth. And the great bulk of their work has not been translated into English. In other words, I'm not breaking new ground. Better minds than mine have been thinking about these things. Okay? But I can't read them. And therefore I am confined to English language sources. When I refer to authors who are available in English, and they are not Orthodox, it is simply to gain the knowledge and valid insights they offer. Like Weaver, for example, or Christopher Dawson, whom I mentioned, or Sorokin, Sorokin was nominally Orthodox, so he was actually not quite Orthodox in his outlooks. So when I refer to these authors who are available in English, and they're not Orthodox, it's to gain the knowledge and valid insights they offer, and then fit this into this puzzle of the overall picture we're creating. Not to accept any non-Orthodox opinions. For example, Sorokin, who regards the idealistic period of the Latin High Middle Ages really as the ideal, pun not intended, the ideal vision of society, even in preference to his own Orthodox heritage. So it's not to accept any of non-Orthodox opinions or adopt a non-Orthodox viewpoint. Now, we do have the Holy Scriptures, we have the Holy Fathers, and a spate of recent Orthodox spiritual writings translated into English. I must say, I became Orthodox in the 1980s, and we have about 1,000% at least more literature in English now than we had when I first became Orthodox back in the 1980s. Okay, so we do have Scriptures, we have the Fathers, we have spiritual writings in English. So with the Fathers, the Scriptures, Fathers, and more recent Orthodox spiritual writings, we have the tools and components to build the foundation of our worldview. And the foundation, of course, is revealed truth and authentic spiritual life. But there is still a tremendous lack, a dearth of historical and philosophical works in English, not to mention literary works, from the Orthodox viewpoint, though a great corpus of these works does exist in other languages, and they could help us today, especially beginning from the 19th century, when Orthodox self-awareness is awakened in traditionalist intellectual circles, both in Russia and in the Balkans. Thus my method. I use whatever good materials I can find in English from outside Orthodoxy, accepting what is useful and rejecting what is not. St. Basil famously said that anything that is true belongs to the Church, and that is certainly still true today. We do have some good Anglophone Orthodox scholars today who are reading texts in the original languages by 19th century native Orthodox historians and philosophers and novelists and poets, and they're making known their insights in their own writing for their fellow English speakers. And I hope to introduce you to some of them as we go along. All right, that's enough for the preliminaries. Let's get started on this class's topic, which is the Great Stereopticon. This class is entitled Other People Creating Our Perceptions, the Great Stereopticon and the Great Stereoscope of the Media Machine. This class, Part A. All the news fit to print. The newspapers. Again, I'll start with a correction. I thought, as I said in the last class, that the Stereopticon was something you put to your eyes like a kaleidoscope or binoculars, but it isn't. A Stereopticon is what was also called the magic lantern, an early kind of slide projector. Using two lenses, the magic lantern could dissolve from one image to another in order to allow the projectionist to go seamlessly through a story of some kind. So it is the precursor of moving picture, of the cinema. What I thought Weaver meant is actually called not the Stereopticon, but rather the stereoscope, like those little viewmasters that we baby boomers had when we were children back in the 50s and 60s. The stereoscope is the precursor of virtual reality devices, as the Stereopticon is the precursor of the cinema. Let's use these two metaphors to understand what the people in charge of the media have done to us and what they're doing to us. The magic lantern or Stereopticon showman would make the circuit of small towns in 19th century America and set up shop, inviting everyone to the amazing experience that he's going to offer, an experience totally unlike anything they've seen before. They would enter a darkened room, maybe in a local schoolhouse or a local tavern or something, where the real world was shut out from view, and the magic lantern storyteller would project wonderful, vivid images of faraway places and people on the wall. For that magic hour or two, the farmer or small-town shopkeeper would enter a magical world of excitement. It is hard for us, right, jaded as we are by every kind of visual stimulus, to imagine how wonderful this was to them, how this amazing new world seemed better and more inviting than their everyday real world. But it was. Of course, this image of simple people sitting in a dark chamber, enthralled by images projected on a wall, recalls the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic. Okay, let's review that real quick. Okay, this is in Plato's Republic. It is an explanation of his theory of knowledge. And he says that this world is like a dark cave, and imagine people sitting on a bench, chained to the bench, and they're only allowed to look at the back wall of the cave, and behind them is a fire, and there are people doing shadow puppet plays, using the light of the fire. They're doing shadow puppet plays on the wall, and the people chained to the bench are looking at the shadow puppet plays, and it's the only reality they've ever known. They were born in the cave, chained to the bench, lived their whole life in the cave, and the only reality they know is the shadow play. And then somebody escapes, and they go out into the real world and see real sun, real moon, real stars, real trees, real water, and so forth. And they come back and they tell the people in the cave, but the people in the cave, for the most part, don't want to believe them. And so this is Plato's theory of knowledge, he believed in the pre-existence of souls, that there was this real world of the forms, and our souls pre-existed in the world of the forms, and then by some cosmic tragedy or accident fell into this world, which is less real, and the things in this world are just images or watered down versions of the real in the world of the forms, the real archetypes in the world of the forms. And a philosopher is someone who escapes this transient world at first in his mind, right, through philosophical ascent, purification and ascent. He realizes the truth of the forms, and he comes back and tries to liberate his fellow prisoners in the cave, and they don't want to be liberated, and so Socrates ends up getting executed and so forth and so on. But my point is not to teach Plato's theory of knowledge, which of course is his ideas of the pre-existence of the soul is completely heretical. The idea is this image of being chained in a cave, which to a great extent is a valid image, right? So as long as these people were chained to their seats and facing the back of the cave, this dark cave was their whole world. And the people doing the shadow puppet play on the wall controlled their perception of reality. This is why Weaver chose the image of the Stereopticon. The projectionist or storyteller controls the audience's perception of reality. I'll say that again. Okay. He controls their perception of reality. They're in a dark room, everything is shut out, and suddenly their whole world gets reduced to these images flashed on the wall. That's the perception of reality, at least for those moments they're in the Stereopticon show. But in the case of the great media powers, in Weaver's time, the publishing houses, the newspaper magnates, the movie studio owners, and the radio networks, the audience is not simply a few people in a room, but everybody. Okay? They've turned the whole country or the whole world into this dark room, and they're the storytellers. And they're throwing the images on the wall. So it's all of organized society, the people at large, the body politic, the American people, everybody. Okay. The whole country, or the whole world, once the whole world's been taken over by these people, is this just one big Stereopticon chamber, and everything else is shut out, and all you see are the images that they're projecting. Now let's look first at the most low-tech component. Today's class, we're going to talk about the lowest tech component of the Stereopticon, the newspaper. Here we are, back in 1948, okay, when Weaver is writing Ideas of Consequences. The Mr. Regular Guy, regular American working man, gets up in the morning and he reads his morning newspaper over breakfast before going off to work. What is most important is not whether he agrees or disagrees with the stated opinions on the editorial page, where the newspaper is openly saying, this is the opinion of our newspaper, and you may agree or disagree with us as you think best. What is important is what is reported simply as news, as objective information. All of the news fit to print, as the New York Times still claims proudly on the front page of every issue. Mr. Regular Guy believes that all the news fit to print really does include everything of importance to him happening in the world today. But he does not stop to think that it is carefully chosen by the New York Times or whoever, and insidiously written with unspoken assumptions and an unspoken purpose, in order to inculcate certain assumptions and reactions to hardwire the reader over time with a certain mindset. It's happened slowly over time. Remember, if you get up and read the newspaper every morning, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, all these unspoken assumptions that are constantly woven into the narrative, right? And then the perception of what's important and what isn't, depending, or what is real, what exists and what isn't, depending on what the New York Times or whoever chooses to put in the newspaper, right? This gradually forms your mind. It's a natural process. It's how the mind works, right? The unsuspecting reader, then, is guided carefully to learn about some things and not other things. and to think a certain way about the things he is allowed to know about. Okay? He's guided to learn about some things and not other things, and he's guided to think a certain way about these things he is allowed to know about. But he does not know he is being guided. He thinks he is simply being informed, catching up on the latest news. And since he wants to appear to his friends to be an informed with-it guy, he diligently keeps reading the news and accepts it as reality. His motto is that of the late great Will Rogers. All I know I learned in the newspapers. As we all know, unconscious assumptions are far more powerful than considered opinions, because unconscious assumptions control us without our knowing we're being controlled. I'll say that again. Unconscious assumptions are far more powerful than considered opinions, because unconscious assumptions control us without our knowing we're being controlled. So Mr. Regular Guy newspaper reader is the prisoner in that dark cave of Plato's Republic, but he does not know it. To our young people today, of course, the print newspaper is in the same category as the woolly mammoth, right? It's a museum exhibit. But over the past 200 years, until the advent of the internet, yes, even during the TV era, newspapers powerfully influenced public opinion. The Washington Post, for example, almost single-handedly brought down President Nixon in 1974, which people my age remember very well. It happened when we were in high school, okay? Or when we were in college. We remember this very well. It was in the middle of the TV era, but the newspapers are still very powerful. It's only very recent that the print newspapers become a relic of the past, and it's because of the advent of the internet. Another, for us Orthodox, much more important example, more important than poor President Nixon, is that in the decade leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, almost all of the newspapers in Russia were controlled by non-Russian, non-Christians. And for this information, I want to thank my friend, Father Matthew Raphael Johnson, who points this out in some of his work. He's one of those Anglophone writers I mentioned earlier. I'll say it again. Another far more important example is that in the decade leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, almost all of the newspapers in Russia, and this is amazing for us to think of, and it shows how soft, really, and how what a non-persecutor the imperial Tsar Nicholas and the imperial government really were. Almost all of the newspapers in Russia were controlled by non-Russian, non-Christians who were attacking the church and the Tsar daily, going at least back to 1905 before, okay? Lying shamelessly about the conditions in the country and promoting a spectrum of revolutionary ideas, all the way from liberal Masonic republicanism to outright violent Marxist anarchism based on mass murder. In reality, the vast majority of the people in Russia loved the established Orthodox order. They had no desire, that is, the ones who were in fact Russians and Christians, right? They had no desire to overthrow the Tsar or persecute the church. And things were actually going well in the country. By the beginning of 1917, Russia was in fact winning the war against the Germans and the Austrians, and even against the Turks in the Eastern Theater, in the Central Asian republics and Persia and so forth. So I'll say that again. By the beginning of 1917, Russia was winning the war. And no less an outside voice than Winston Churchill, whom we Orthodox have a lot of criticism of. But Churchill was objective, and he said Russia was winning the war, and he said Tsar Nicholas was shamelessly and unjustly forced to abdicate. Russia was winning the war against the Germans and the Austrians and the Turks, and food and supplies were more plentiful than at any time since the beginning of the war. But the educated city dwellers who lived in the centers of power, Moscow and St. Petersburg, and who read the newspapers to form their opinions, were convinced that the army and the country were in turmoil. Thus, the newspapers confused and disoriented the leadership class, as well as influencing opinion abroad, and this greatly contributed to the circumstances that made possible the February 1917 overthrow of the Tsar, and then his abdication on 2nd March Old Style, an anniversary we marked last week, a very apocalyptic anniversary we marked last week, this past Friday. So this confusion and disorientation created by the newspapers greatly contributed to the circumstances that made possible the February 1917 overthrow of the Tsar, and eventually to the 1917 October Revolution. Examples like this could be multiplied a lot. Okay. Besides understanding the destruction wreaked by the propaganda content of the newspapers, moreover, we should also look at the medium itself, right, through our Orthodox lens and how it affects our minds. The medium itself, apart from what's in it. Okay. The very nature of a newspaper emphasizes constant feverish change. It excites empty curiosity. It encourages everyone, no matter how uninformed or, it encourages everyone to hold violent and uninformed opinions which increase social discord and make the population easy to manipulate. The first royal governor of Virginia outlawed newspapers. Back in the 17th century, it was easy to see how these were tools of special interests to cause discord and to overthrow lawful authority. Right? Look at what a newspaper is. It's a sheaf of cheap paper you pick up on your front porch in the morning and toss in the garbage in the evening, containing a bunch of fragmentary, quite possibly false data, along with brazen, shallow, and often outrageously idiotic opinions expressed at a very low mental level. The mind formed by newspapers tends then to a short attention span, shallowness of thought, feverish curiosity, and a coarse, low, vulgar, stupid mode of spoken and written expression. It degrades people. It is easy to see how this militates against a healthy spiritual life, even a healthy intellectual and emotional life. The newspaper mind is the diametrical opposite of the attentive mind, described by the Holy Fathers as the normal mental state for a Christian. Of course, in the present age of information overload through the internet, this terrible assault on the mind has, as they say, gone on steroids. Instead of a limited dose of mental noise once a day with your morning newspaper, one gets addicted to tweets and Instagrams and all that sort of thing all day long, flooding the mind with a constant stream of fragmentary, soul-numbing, noisy chaos. But the newspaper started it. For our historical understanding, it's important to remember the newspaper started it. So how does one escape the cave of the newspaper mind? This Stereopticon created by the newspaper and its successor media. What short list of practical suggestions can we take home from our class today? Obviously, we have to do our daily prayers. Right? Priests are always saying that. I know people get tired of hearing the priests saying that, but we say it for a reason. We have to do our daily prayers, scripture reading, and other spiritual reading. Let's add a few more things to make a short list. Let's say a 3-point program. Number 1, limit your media. For example, turn all media devices off by 8 p.m. and read books. And I know that's let me say that again, and that's an astounding command. Read books until it's time for your night prayers. That's right, read books. They still exist. Get the family together and read to each other. Try it, you'll like it. 2, do not engage in constant chatter or arguments about the latest manufactured controversy dramatized in the media. I'll say that again. Do not engage in constant chatter or arguments about the latest manufactured controversy dramatized in the media. We must develop a way of looking at life sub specie eternitatis, that is, from the viewpoint of eternity. The Orthodox mind sees everything in perspective, from the viewpoint of the entirety of history, and with the purpose of history in mind, which is an eternal purpose. We always remember that the sovereign God is in charge, that He loves us, and that He is working out His purpose in history. This makes us serene and confident so that we can take meaningful, conscious action and not just react to stimuli like Pavlov's dogs. Remember that all these daily news dramas are phony. They're the shadow puppet show that keeps you in the cave. Okay? Reality is much bigger than that. Okay? 3, and 3 is a natural follow-up on 2. Spend real time with the real people around you and do the limited, real good you can do for them. Say that again. Spend real time with the real people around you and do the limited, and it is limited, right? Because we're finite creatures, right? And we don't save our souls by our works, right? We're saved by God. Spend limited real time with the real people around you and do the limited real good you can do for them. The person next to you is much more important than a politician or a movie star or a pro athlete or a TV commentator. Okay? Shut off the devices and talk. Get to know your neighbors. I know that's revolutionary nowadays. For that matter, get to know your family. Spend as much time in the real world as possible. May the merciful and man-befriending Lord, who gave us this great Lent of 2019 as the day of our salvation, grant us the grace to live in reality, to live in hope, and do His holy will. Amen.